This ebook is brought to you by Egenvard 1998. Stages of development. Although Freud had little first-hand experience with children, including his own, his developmental theory is almost exclusively a discussion of early childhood. To Freud, the first 4 or 5 years of life, or the infantile stage, are the most crucial for personality formation. This stage is followed by a 6 or 7 year period of latency during which time little or no sexual growth takes place. Then at puberty, a renaissance of sexual life occurs, and the genital stage is ushered in. Psychosexual development eventually culminates in maturity. Infantile period. One of Freud's most important assumptions is that infants possess a sexual life and go through a period of pregenital sexual development during the first 4 or 5 years after birth. At the time Freud originally wrote about infantile sexuality, the concept, though not new, was met with some resistance. Today, however, nearly all close observers accept the idea that children show an interest in the genitals, delight in sexual pleasure, and manifest sexual excitement. Childhood sexuality differs from adult sexuality in that it is not capable of reproduction and is exclusively autoerotic. With both children and adults, however, the sexual impulse is particularly sensitive to erogenous stimulation. Freud divided the infantile stage into 3 phases according to which of the 3 primary erogenous zones is undergoing the most salient development. The oral phase begins first and is followed in order by the anal phase and the phallic phase. The 3 infantile stages overlap with one another and each continues after the onset of later stages. Oral phase. Because the mouth is the first organ to provide an infant with pleasure, Freud's first infantile stage of development is the oral phase. Infants obtain life-sustaining nourishment through the oral cavity, but beyond that, they also gain pleasure through the act of sucking. The sexual aim of early oral activity is to incorporate or receive into one's body the object choice, that is, the nipple. During this oral-receptive phase, infants feel no ambivalence toward the pleasurable object and their needs are usually satisfied with a minimum of frustration and anxiety. As they grow older, however, they are more likely to experience feelings of frustration and anxiety as a result of scheduled feedings, increased time lapses between feedings, and eventual weaning. These anxieties are generally accompanied by feelings of ambivalence toward their love object, mother, and by the increased ability of their budding ego to defend itself against the environment and against anxiety. Infants' defense against the environment is greatly aided by the emergence of teeth. At this point, they pass into a second oral phase, which Freud called the oral sadistic period. During this phase, infants respond to others through biting, cooing, closing their mouth, smiling, and crying. Their first autoerotic experience is thumb-sucking, a defense against anxiety that satisfies their sexual but not their nutritional needs. As children grow older, the mouth continues to be an erogenous zone, and by the time they become adults, they are capable of gratifying their oral needs in a variety of ways, including sucking candy, chewing gum, biting pencils, overeating, smoking cigarettes, pipes and cigars, and making biting sarcastic remarks. Anal phase. The aggressive drive, which during the first year of life takes the form of oral sadism, reaches fuller development during the second year when the anus emerges as a sexually pleasurable zone. Because this period is characterized by satisfaction gained through aggressive behavior and through the excretory function, Freud called it the Sadistic-anal phase, or more briefly the anal phase of development. This phase is divided into 2 subphases, the early anal and the late anal. During the early anal period, children receive satisfaction by destroying or losing objects. At this time, the destructive nature of the sadistic drive is stronger than the erotic one, and children often behave aggressively toward their parents for frustrating them with toilet training. Then, when children enter the late anal period, they sometimes take a friendly interest toward their feces, an interest that stems from the erotic pleasure of defecating. Frequently, children will present their feces to the parents as a valued prize. If their behavior is accepted and praised by their parents, then children are likely to grow into generous and magnanimous adults. However, if their gift is rejected in a punitive fashion, children may adopt another method of obtaining anal pleasure, withholding the feces until the pressure becomes both painful and erotically stimulating. This mode of narcissistic and masochistic pleasure lays the foundation for the anal character people who continue to receive erotic satisfaction by keeping and possessing objects and by arranging them in an excessively neat and orderly fashion. Freud hypothesized that people who grow into anal characters were, as children, overly resistant to toilet training, often holding back their feces and prolonging the time of training beyond that usually required. This anal eroticism becomes transformed into the anal triad of orderliness, stinginess, and obstinacy that typifies the adult anal character. Freud believed that, for girls, anal eroticism is carried over into penis envy during the phallic stage and can eventually be expressed by giving birth to a baby. He also believed that in the unconscious the concepts of penis and baby, because both are referred to as a little one, mean the same thing. Also, feces, because of its elongated shape and because it has been removed from the body, is indistinguishable from baby, and all three concepts, penis, baby, and feces, are represented by the same symbols in dreams. During the oral and anal stages, no basic distinction exists between male and female psychosexual growth. Children of either gender can develop an active or a passive orientation. The active attitude often is characterized by what Freud considered the masculine qualities of dominance and sadism, whereas the passive orientation is usually marked by the feminine qualities of voyeurism and masochism. However, either orientation, or any combination of the two, can develop in both girls and boys. Phallic phase. At approximately 3 or 4 years of age, children begin a third stage of infantile development, the phallic phase, a time when the genital area becomes the leading erogenous zone. This stage is marked for the first time by a dichotomy between male and female development, a distinction that Freud believed to be due to the anatomical differences between the sexes. Freud took Napoleon's remark that history is destiny and changed it to anatomy is destiny. This dictum underlies Freud's belief that physical differences between males and females account for many important psychological differences. Masturbation, which originated during the oral stage, now enters a second, more crucial phase. During the phallic stage, masturbation is nearly universal. But because parents generally suppress these activities, children usually repress their conscious desire to masturbate by the time their phallic period comes to an end. Just as children's earlier experiences with weaning and toilet training helped shape the foundation of their psychosexual development, so too does their experience with the suppression of masturbation. However, their experience with the Oedipus complex plays an even more crucial role in their personality development. Male Oedipus complex. Freud believed that preceding the phallic stage an infant boy forms an identification with his father, that is, he wants to be his father. Later he develops a sexual desire for his mother, that is, he wants to have his mother. These two wishes do not appear mutually contradictory to the underdeveloped ego, so they are able to exist side by side for a time. When the boy finally recognizes their inconsistency, he gives up his identification with his father and retains the stronger feeling, the desire to have his mother. The boy now sees his father as a rival for the mother's love. He desires to do away with his father and possess his mother in a sexual relationship. This condition of rivalry toward the father and incestuous feelings toward the mother is known as the simple male Oedipus complex. The term is taken from the Greek tragedy by Sophocles, in which Oedipus, king of Thebes, is destined by fate to kill his father and marry his mother. Freud believed that the bisexual nature of the child, of either gender, complicates this picture. Before a young boy enters the Oedipus stage, he develops some amount of a feminine disposition. During the Oedipal period, therefore, his feminine nature may lead him to display affection toward his father and express hostility toward his mother, while at the same time his masculine tendency disposes him toward hostility for father and lust for mother. During this ambivalent condition, known as the complete Oedipus complex, affection and hostility coexist because one or both feelings may be unconscious. Freud believed that these feelings of ambivalence in a boy play a role in the evolution of the castration complex, which for boys takes the form of castration anxiety or the fear of losing the penis. To Freud, the castration complex begins after a young boy, who has assumed that all other people, including girls, have genitals like his own, becomes aware of the absence of a penis on girls. This awareness becomes the greatest emotional shock of his life. After a period of mental struggle and attempts at denial, the young boy is forced to conclude that the girl has had her penis cut off. This belief may be reinforced by parental threats to punish the boy for his sexual behaviors. The boy is then forced to conclude that the little girl has been punished by having her penis removed because she masturbated or because she seduced her mother. For the boy, the threat of castration now becomes a dreaded possibility. Because this castration anxiety cannot long be tolerated, the boy represses his impulses toward sexual activity, including his fantasies of carrying out a seduction of his mother. Prior to his sudden experience of castration anxiety, the little boy may have seen the genital area of little girls or his mother. But this sight does not automatically instigate the castration complex. Castration anxiety bursts forth only when the boy's ego is mature enough to comprehend the connection between sexual desires and the removal of the penis. Freud believed that castration anxiety was present in all boys, even those not personally threatened with the removal of their penis or the stunting of its growth. A boy does not need to receive a clear threat of castration. Any mention of injury or shrinkage in connection with the penis is sufficient to activate the child's phylogenetic endowment. Phylogenetic endowment is capable of filling the gaps of how individual experiences with the inherited experiences of our ancestors. Ancient man's fear of castration supports the individual child's experiences and results in universal castration anxiety. Freud stated, "It is not a question of whether castration is really carried out, what is decisive is that the danger threatens from the outside and that the child believes in it." He went on to say that hints at punishment must regularly find a phylogenetic reinforcement in him. It is our suspicion that during the human family's primeval period castration used actually to be carried out by a jealous and cruel father upon growing boys, and that circumcision, which so frequently plays a part in puberty rites among primitive peoples, is a clearly recognizable relic of it. Once his Oedipus complex is dissolved or repressed, the boy surrenders his incestuous desires, changes them into feelings of tender love, and begins to develop a primitive superego. He may identify with either the father or the mother, depending on the strength of his feminine disposition. Normally identification is with the father, but it is not the same as pre-Oedipal identification. The boy no longer wants to be his father, instead, he uses his father as a model for determining right and wrong behavior. He introjects or incorporates his father's authority into his own ego, thereby sowing the seeds of a mature superego. The budding superego takes over his father's prohibitions against incest and ensures the continued repression of the Oedipus complex. Female Oedipus complex. The phallic phase takes a more complicated path for girls than for boys, and these differences are due to anatomical differences between the sexes. Like boys, pre-Oedipal girls assume that all other children have genitals similar to their own. Soon they discover that boys not only possess different genital equipment, but apparently something extra. Girls then become envious of this appendage, feel cheated, and desire to have a penis. This experience of penis envy is a powerful force in the formation of girls' personality. Unlike castration anxiety in boys, which is quickly repressed, penis envy may last for years in one form or another. Freud believed that penis envy is often expressed as a wish to be a boy or a desire to have a man. Almost universally, it is carried over into a wish to have a baby, and eventually it may find expression in the act of giving birth to a baby, especially a boy. Preceding the castration complex, a girl establishes an identification with her mother similar to that developed by a boy, that is, she fantasizes being seduced by her mother. These incestuous feelings, according to Freud, are later turned into hostility when the girl holds her mother responsible for bringing her into the world without a penis. Her libido is then turned toward her father, who can satisfy her wish for a penis by giving her a baby, an object that to her has become a substitute for the phallus. The desire for sexual intercourse with the father and accompanying feelings of hostility for the mother are known as the simple female Oedipus complex. Incidentally, Freud objected to the term Electra complex, sometimes used by others when referring to the female Oedipus complex, because it suggests a direct parallel between male and female development during the phallic stage. Freud believed that no such parallel exists and that differences in anatomy determine different courses in male and female sexual development after the phallic stage. Not all girls, however, transfer their sexual interest onto their father and develop hostility toward their mother. Freud suggested that when pre-Oedipal girls acknowledge their castration and recognize their inferiority to boys, they will rebel in one of three ways. First, they may give up their sexuality, both the feminine and the masculine dispositions, and develop an intense hostility toward their mother. Second, they may cling defiantly to their masculinity, hoping for a penis and fantasizing being a man. And third, they may develop normally, that is, they may take their father as a sexual choice and undergo the simple Oedipus complex. A girl's choice is influenced in part by her inherent bisexuality and the degree of masculinity she developed during the pre-Oedipal period. The simple female Oedipus complex is resolved when a girl gives up masturbatory activity, surrenders her sexual desire for her father, and identifies once again with her mother. However, the female Oedipus complex is usually broken up more slowly and less completely than is the male's. Because the superego is built from the relics of the shattered Oedipus complex, Freud believed that the girl's superego is usually weaker, more flexible, and less severe than the boy's. The reason the girl's superego is not as strict as the boy's is traceable to the difference between the sexes during their Oedipal histories. For boys, castration anxiety follows the Oedipus complex, breaks it up nearly completely, and renders unnecessary the continued expenditure of psychic energy on its remnants. Once the Oedipus complex is shattered, energy used to maintain it is free to establish a superego. For girls, however, the Oedipus complex follows the castration complex, penis envy, and because girls do not experience a threat of castration, they experience no traumatic sudden shock. The female Oedipus complex is only incompletely resolved by the girl's gradual realization that she may lose the love of her mother and that sexual intercourse with her father is not forthcoming. Her libido thus remains partially expended to maintain the castration complex and its relics, thereby blocking some psychic energy that might otherwise be used to build a strong superego. In summary, the female and male phallic stages take quite different routes. First, the castration complex for girls takes the form of penis envy, not castration anxiety. Second, penis envy precedes the female Oedipus complex, whereas for boys the opposite is true, that is, the castration anxiety follows the male Oedipus complex. Third, because penis envy takes place prior to the female Oedipus complex, little girls do not experience a traumatic event comparable to boys' castration anxiety. Fourth, because girls do not experience this traumatic event, the female Oedipus complex is more slowly and less completely dissolved than the male Oedipus complex. Although he framed these views on femininity in a tentative and provisional manner, he soon began to vigorously defend them. When some of his followers objected to his harsh view of women, Freud became even more adamant in his position and insisted that psychological differences between men and women could not be erased by culture because they were the inevitable consequences of anatomical differences between the sexes. This rigid public stance on feminine development has led some writers to criticize him as being sexist and uncomplimentary to women. Despite his steadfast public position, Freud privately was uncertain that his views on women represented a final answer. 1 year after his pronouncement that anatomy is destiny, he expressed some doubts, admitting that his understanding of girls and women was incomplete. We know less about the sexual life of little girls than of boys. But we need not feel ashamed of this distinction. After all, the sexual life of adult women is a dark continent for psychology. Throughout his career, Freud often proposed theories without much clinical or experimental evidence to support them. he would later come to see most of these theories as established facts, even though he possessed no intervening substantiating evidence. For as long as he lived, however, he remained doubtful of the absolute validity of his theories on women. Freud once admitted to his friend Marie Bonaparte that he did not understand women. The great question that has never been answered and which I have not yet been able to answer, despite my 30 years of research into the feminine soul, is what does a woman want? Such a question posed after many years of theorizing suggests that Freud regarded women not only as quite different from men, but as enigmas, not comprehensible to the male gender. Latency period. Freud believed that, from the 4th or 5th year until puberty, both boys and girls usually, but not always, go through a period of dormant psychosexual development. This latency stage is brought about partly by parents' attempts to punish or discourage sexual activity in their young children. If parental suppression is successful, children will repress their sexual drive and direct their psychic energy toward school, friendships, hobbies, and other non-sexual activities. However, the latency stage may also have roots in our phylogenetic endowment. Freud suggested that the Oedipus complex and the subsequent period of sexual latency might be explained by the following hypothesis. Early in human development, people lived in families headed by a powerful father who reserved all sexual relationships to himself and who killed or drove away his sons, whom he saw as a threat to his authority. Then one day the sons joined together, overwhelmed, killed, and devoured their father. However, the brothers were individually too weak to take over their father's heritage, so they banded together in a clan or totem and established prohibitions against what they had just done, that is, they outlawed both killing one's father and having sexual relations with female members of one's family. Later, when they became fathers, they suppressed sexual activity in their own children whenever it became noticeable, probably around 3 or 4 years of age. When suppression became complete, it led to a period of sexual latency. After this experience was repeated over a period of many generations, it became an active though unconscious force in an individual's psychosexual development. Thus, the prohibition of sexual activity is part of our phylogenetic endowment and needs no personal experiences of punishment for sexual activities to repress the sexual drive. Freud merely suggested this hypothesis as one possible explanation for the latency period, and he was careful to point out that it was unsupported by anthropological data. Continued latency is reinforced through constant suppression by parents and teachers and by internal feelings of shame, guilt, and morality. The sexual drive, of course, still exists during latency, but its aim has been inhibited. The sublimated libido now shows itself in social and cultural accomplishments. During this time the sexual drive was completely autoerotic. Genital period. Puberty signals a reawakening of the sexual aim and the beginning of the genital period. During puberty, the diphasic sexual life of a person enters a second stage, which has basic differences from the infantile period. First, adolescents give up autoeroticism and direct their sexual energy toward another person instead of toward themselves. Second, reproduction is now possible. Third, although penis envy may continue to linger in girls, the vagina finally obtains the same status for them that the penis had for them during infancy. Parallel to this, boys now see the female organ as a sought-after object rather than a source of trauma. Fourth, the entire sexual drive takes on a more complete organization. And the component drives that had operated somewhat independently during the early infantile period gain a kind of synthesis during adolescence. Thus, the mouth, anus, and other pleasure-producing areas take an auxiliary position to the genitals, which now attain supremacy as an erogenous zone. This synthesis of eros, the elevated status of the vagina, the reproductive capacity of the sexual drive, and ability of people to direct their libido outward rather than onto the self represent the major distinctions between infantile and adult sexuality. In several other ways, however, eros remains unchanged. It may continue to be repressed, sublimated, or expressed in masturbation or other sexual acts. The subordinated erogenous zones also continue as vehicles of erotic pleasure. The mouth, for example, retains many of its infantile activities. A person may discontinue thumb sucking but may add smoking or prolonged kissing. Maturity. The genital period begins at puberty and continues throughout the individual's lifetime. It is a stage attained by everyone who reaches physical maturity. In addition to the genital stage, Freud alluded to but never fully conceptualized a period of psychological maturity. A stage attained after a person has passed through the earlier developmental periods in an ideal manner. Unfortunately, psychological maturity seldom happens, because people have too many opportunities to develop pathological disorders or neurotic predispositions. Although Freud never fully conceptualized the notion of psychological maturity, we can draw a sketch of psychoanalytically mature individuals. Such people would have a balance among the structures of the mind, with their ego controlling their ID and superego but at the same time allowing for reasonable desires and demands. Therefore, their ID impulses would be expressed honestly and consciously with no traces of shame or guilt, and their superego would move beyond parental identification and control with no remnants of antagonism or incest. Their ego ideal would be realistic and congruent with their ego, and in fact, the boundary between their superego and their ego would become nearly imperceptible. Consciousness would play a more important role in the behavior of mature people, who would have only a minimal need to repress sexual and aggressive urges. Indeed, most of the repressions of psychologically healthy individuals would emerge in the form of sublimations rather than neurotic symptoms. Because the Oedipus complex of mature people is completely or nearly completely dissolved, their libido, which formerly was directed toward parents, would be released to search for both tender and sensual love. In short, psychologically mature people would come through the experiences of childhood and adolescence in control of their psychic energy and with their ego functioning in the center of an ever-expanding world of consciousness.